Uhuru, Uhuru Sasa, which means freedom now in Kiswahili. And we just completed the Jazz Zone with T in Providence. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne has been a contributor. The Horne Report has been on Diasporic music for decades. And this is June is Black Music Month, and we have been recommending Dr. Horne's book, Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music. And I would like to quote Akinyele Umoja, who is a professor of African American Studies at Georgia State University. And this is a quote, applies an analysis of political economy in explaining the role of monopoly capitalism and organized crime in exploiting the art form of classical Black music, end of quote. And Dr. Horne, how are you doing today, sir?
It's all good.
We have a lot to talk about, and we are really interested. I know I'm interested, and I know the listeners are interested in the whole question of Apple in People's Republic of China. That is a burning issue. What is your take on that situation?
There's a new book, Apple in China. I read the book because, as you know, I'm working on a project dealing with China-U.S. relations from 1949, the era of the Chinese Revolution, up to the present. And I should mention in that context the rather fire-breathing speech given by Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth at the Shangri-La Forum, as it's called in Singapore, where he basically was threatening war against China. And we need to take this very seriously because the U.S. imperialism recognizes that China's in the passing lane. They do not want to recognize that that has taken place not only because of the tireless labor of Chinese workers, the investment of the Chinese diaspora from Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaya, etc., but also because of the fact that the U.S. strategy of wooing Maoist China as a way to destabilize the Soviet Union, which they thought was a great victory when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, now they're beginning to rue that decision, but nobody goes back and actually acknowledges that maniacal obsession with Moscow helped to create the present dilemma. And so Apple in China, in many ways, is a carry-on to all of those various issues because Apple, this multi-trillion-dollar corporation headquartered in Cupertino, California, the manufacturer, or at least the designer of the iPhone, I withdrew the term manufacturing because actually, as it's well known, they're oftentimes manufactured in China. And of course, with the pressure of Mr. Trump, they're trying to move production to India. And China was the beneficiary, quote unquote, of Apple training perhaps 28 million Chinese workers, which is larger than the labor force of California, in order to produce their various products, the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod, etc. And so now, as I said, U.S. imperialism is angry with regard to what it has wrought, and it would like to turn the tables on both China and Apple. And in fact, we normally don't give out investment advice on this particular program, but it doesn't take a wizard of Wall Street to recognize that Apple is in for rather rough times going ahead. And if you were a canny investor, if you are a canny investor, you might want to short Apple stock. That is to say, bet on the value of that stock falling.
Now you're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Melinda, I know you have a question.
Yes, let's go to Japan. Plays hardball with U.S.
Well, as we know, ever since early August 1945, when U.S. imperialism dropped atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, causing and instigating Japan to surrender during the Pacific War. Japan, in many ways, has tried to avoid confrontation with U.S. imperialism, which, in a sense, I understand, because recall what happened in the mid-1980s. In the mid-1980s, there was a lot of hysteria in Washington and Wall Street that Japan was in the passing lane, not unlike the hysteria about China being in the passing lane today. And of course, you don't have to be an oracle to come to the conclusion that you may want to put this in the broader context of European nations and progeny of Europe, speaking of the United States of America, involved in a centuries-long battle against Asian nations, who of course have an advantage, particularly if you look at China in terms of population. And as the social scientists like to say, at a certain point, quantity becomes quality. That is to say, this fact that China's population, about 4 times larger than that of the United States of America, has a certain quality all of its own. So in 1985, in the midst of all this hysteria, the panic, as we called it at the time, the North Atlantic nations, led by the United States, ganged up on China. And in the infamous Plaza Accords, and I might add parenthetically that ultimately, when Donald J. Trump controlled the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, where these accords were negotiated, they forced a revaluation of the Japanese currency, which sent the Japanese economy tumbling into what was called the lost decades. And now, the North Atlantic countries, according to press reports, would like to play the same trick on China, but I don't think it'll work this time. That is to say, forcing a revaluation of the Chinese currency, which is one of the reasons why Washington has become ever more bellicose with regard to its allegations concerning China, reference my recent remark about Pete Hegseth speaking of the Shangri-La Forum in Singapore. And so now you see that Japan, they're beginning to draw down their investment in U.S. Treasury bills. These are loans to the United States government to keep the U.S. government afloat, everything from the Pentagon to the post office. You see that after both Biden and Trump had suggested that they did not want Nippon Steel of Japan to invest in or swallow altogether U.S. Steel, once a shining emblem of U.S. capitalism and imperialism, but now falling on hard times. Now you see that as a result of Japanese pressure, Japanese hardball, if you like, Mr. Trump is backing away. But like the outlaw in the Old West, who backs out of the saloon with both guns blazing, Mr. Trump, in terms of acquiescing Nippon Steel, has also announced that he's raising tariffs on exported steel, for example, from Canada, for example. So once again, Canada is becoming a kind of punching bag for U.S. imperialism, which I'm sure will not go down very well in Ottawa.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96, and on May 29th, Maurice Bishop, the late great Maurice Bishop, was born in Aruba in the Dutch Caribbean. And I'm mentioning that because the AU and the CARICOM, the AU, African Union, and CARICOM is having a summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And I know you have been advocating that Black people from the Western Hemisphere show up and participate in that event. And have you got any feedback on anybody actually going to make that trek?
I have, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we'll see who turns up in September in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. But high on the agenda will be reparations, not only reparations to Namibia, which, by the way, just the other day had a commemoration for the first genocide of the 20th century, the genocide inflicted by German invaders on the Nama and Herero people, 1904 to 1908. Some of the same people who inflicted that genocide went on to instigate what has been called the Holocaust in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. Obviously, there's been a more significant outcry in 1904 to 1908, perhaps we could have forestalled the so-called Holocaust of the early 1930s to 1945. So reparations will be high on the agenda, and I think that's one of the pressing issues from our friends in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago, for example. And obviously, reparations is high on the agenda for many Black people in the United States of America. And obviously, it would be in our interest to show up in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And I say this particularly because we see some backsliding of late. I'm looking at Wes Moore, the Black man who was the governor of Maryland, who is thinking about running for president in 2028. He denies that he's running for president. He denies that his vetoing of a bill out of the legislature in Maryland to study the question of reparations. He denies that that veto has anything to do with his presidential aspirations. But in a sense, his veto bespeaks the kind of pressure that's going to be placed upon various forces in the United States in the run-up to this important meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And that's all the more reason for our forces to descend upon Ethiopia. My understanding is that some of the would-be delegations from North America, they have not heard from the African Union or CARICOM, even though they reached out to them. And this may have something to do with the fact that they recognize these African and Caribbean nations, that Mr. Trump is rather vengeful and believes in vendettas, and perhaps he has intimidated these countries. So I've suggested that those interested in going to this summit should instead seek information from the Ethiopian website concerning tourism and act as if they're just going to see the sights of Addis Ababa, and then book airline reservations and hotel reservations and make a beeline for the African Union headquarters on September 7th, 2025.
It's my understanding that this brother, the mayor of Baltimore, happens to be, his heritage is African American and a Jamaican.
Well, that would not surprise me. That's not unusual in this country. But obviously, he doesn't wield that much influence with the governor. Interesting, Maryland plays a big role in my book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, because Maryland, as is known, is right next door to Washington. And unlike Virginia, where there is a river separating Washington from the Cavalier State, you can walk from Tacoma Park, Maryland, into the District of Columbia, for example. And as a result, Maryland played an essential role in the subversion of the early United States in the first few decades of the 19th century. Maryland had the largest free Black population in the United States of America. Probably Baltimore was the most influential city amongst Black people in the United States pre-U.S. Civil War, 1861. As a result, there was a systematic effort in Maryland to deport en masse the free Negro population. And if you look at the history of Liberia, for example, the West African state initiated from these shores about 200 years ago, part of the initial purpose was to deport en masse the free Negro population. And in fact, Maryland set up its own colony in West Africa called Cape Thomas that eventually was swallowed by Liberia. It's very unusual for a state to have its own foreign policy because that goes against the grain of the U.S. Constitution. So in any case, Maryland today, as a result of this historic legacy, you have a Black governor, you have a Black senator, you have a Black mayor of Baltimore, as you noted, you have a Black attorney general. There's probably more political muscle exemplified by Black people in Maryland than any other state. And that's one of the reasons why Marylanders in particular need to show up en masse in Addis Ababa in September 2025.
The next question is Melinda. I think the MVP of the NBA is a young man with Antiguan roots, and you can ask the question, Melinda. I'm sorry for that.
The thing around
MVP of the NBA. He's a brother from in Toronto, and Shea is Shea Alexander, but I have a problem with his name myself. But he was MVP. He is the MVP of the NBA, and he was born in Toronto and grew up in Hamilton.
Yes, he did. And what's interesting about Shea Alexander, whose Oklahoma City Thunder will be competing for the championship against the Indiana Pacers beginning within a day or two, is that, I'm reading the Toronto Globe and Mail on a regular basis right now. And I noticed that in the Globe and Mail, when they did a write-up on Mr. Alexander, they put it in a nationalist context. That is to say, this shows that Canadian basketball can compete U.S. basketball. They're doing the same thing with the Stanley Cup and the Edmonton Oilers competing for hockey's latest prize. Everything is becoming a sort of contest with U.S. imperialism, at least as far as the Toronto Globe and Mail is concerned. The only question is it too little, too late? But in any case, SGA, as he is called, is a superb basketball player and is a very serious young man, very serious about his craft, very serious about his skills. He's about 6'6" tall. He's a great ball handler, a great shooter, a great defender, and already it's predicted that he will cap off this NBA season, this basketball season, by emerging triumphant with his Oklahoma City Thunder at the end of this series with the Indiana Pacers.
He is quite a character in terms of. I think he was underrated. He didn't make I guess like Michael Jordan. He didn't make I think it was the high school basketball team, and he had a lot to prove. And I was the brother who coached him. Had faith in him and brought him all the way. Could you talk about that?
Oh, sure. I mean, the Toronto Globe and Mail has been playing up that story. Of course, the fact that he's 6'6" tall and is rather nimble and agile obviously asserted itself finally. And I also came to find out something I didn't know, because in the context of talking about Canadian basketball, of course, they had to bring up Steve Nash, who was the last Canadian to become MVP. And I did not realize that Steve Nash has roots right here in Victoria, British Columbia, believe it or not.
Yes, he does.
Which is something that I was taken aback by.
Well, let me give you a joke. The Globe and Mail, I wrote for the Globe and Mail, and the Globe and Mail pays of all the newspapers in Toronto, the Globe and Mail pays the least. And what they tell you is that if you're publishing the Globe and Mail, they will read you in all the embassies. They'll read you in Nigeria, in the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria, and in Chile and in Belize and da 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 da. But that's your money. But the second thing is that I got fired from the Globe and Mail because I wrote a review about Malcolm X criticizing Zionism. I was asked to, I was given my walking papers because of an interview I did about Malcolm X and Zionism. Just for the
Well, of course, that bleeds into one of the issues on our agenda, which is the changing, or what we hope is the changing view of Israel and Zionism, not only by Canada, but by Britain and France. Recall that they co-authored a statement upbraiding the Israeli authorities for the depredations they're inflicting on Gaza and Palestine. This is accompanied by the fact that Spain has attended, or did attend a few days ago, the Arab League meeting in Iraq,
Spain is leading an effort at the United Nations in a few days, which will lead, we hope, to concrete steps toward recognition of Palestinian statehood. At the same time, U.S. imperialism under Mr. Trump, the current press reports suggest that there is a kind of rift between Mr. Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, but it may reflect the fact that Mr. Trump, when he goes to the Persian Gulf, he expects to receive gifts like a $400 million plane. Recall that when Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa showed up in the Oval Office, made what was considered to be a joke, apologizing for the fact that he didn't have a plane to give Mr. Trump. And Israel is in no position to make $400 million gifts to Mr. Trump. In fact, they have their hand out and their begging bowl out, wanting goodies from Mr. Trump and from Washington's Treasury in general. And inevitably, that's going to lead to rifts because Mr. Trump, as the chief executive officer of the ruling class of the United States of America, would like to focus on China and oftentimes sees this attempt by Israel to destabilize China's allies, speaking of Iran, by bombing their nuclear facilities in the hope that it will change the calculus in the North Atlantic community, forcing them to rally around the Israeli flag. Mr. Trump apparently is not as enthusiastic about that kind of gambit as Israel expected. And Israel, in any case, is going through a major crisis. The latest news from the Wall Street Journal is that two of Mr. Netanyahu's closest comrades were slated to be indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But alas, the chief prosecutor, a few days ago, got caught up in a Me Too scandal, and now he's had to step down temporarily, and so the prosecution has been shunted aside for the time being. But bedeviling Israel as we speak is the fact that suicides are going up, divorces are going up, bankruptcies are going up. A significant percentage of the skilled population is fleeing for Australia, for Western Europe, for New Zealand, for Brooklyn, etc. And so Israel is going through a real crisis now. On campuses in the United States of America, of course, it's led to Mr. Trump's crackdown on Harvard. And apparently, as the story is oftentimes repeated, he would like to burn down the house in order to roast the pig. That is to say, in order to uproot anti-Israeli protesters, he's willing to destabilize Harvard University. International students, their attempt to gain admission there are being circumscribed. Federal dollars from Washington that go into scientific research to find cures and ameliorations for tuberculosis, malaria, Alzheimer's, heart disease, etc. They're being shut off. For example, you have U.S. scientists fleeing to Europe where a red carpet has been rolled out by Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, and by President Macron of France. And so what's happening is that Israel, in its crisis, simultaneously is dragging down U.S. imperialism. And for those of us with a sense of history, this should not be surprising because the calling card of settler colonialism in North America, particularly in the United States, was that unlike Europe, it was rolling out the red carpet for Jewish migrants from Europe who routinely were persecuted, with the Holocaust being Exhibit A in that regard. And so there's something rather ironic, minimally, about the fact that Israel, which was back from its inception by Washington, is helping to not only drag down itself, but drag down U.S. imperialism, which may be an appropriate closure for settler colonialism in both historic Palestine and in North America.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. can we talk about the King of Canada, Prince Philip,
No, King Charles III.
King Charles? Oh, senior moment. Sorry about that. Can we talk about that?
Well, I'm sure I don't have to remind you folks that Ottawa made a big to-do about inviting parasite number one, King of Canada, King Charles III, to Ottawa. Supposedly, this was supposed to be sending a signal to Mr. Trump that he should back off trying to make Canada the 51st state. I think that that's, shall we say, delusional. I don't think Mr. Trump can be deterred by the fact that parasite number one showed up in Ottawa with the woman we refer to as Queen Camellia, because he lives in London and Great Britain is trying to cut its own deals with U.S. imperialism, which is one of the reasons why when Prime Minister Keir Starmer was in the Oval Office just a few weeks ago, he extended an invitation for a second state visit of Mr. Trump. So I'm trying to figure out what Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, is thinking about. And in any case, folks in Canada need to have serious debate and discussion about this role of the Governor General, who is the King's representative and ordinarily gives the so-called throne speech. That is to say, an outline of what the government's priorities are. Because those of us who are familiar with Commonwealth history recognize that in Australia, some decades ago, the Governor General played a dastardly role in destabilizing the Labor government of Dolph Whitlam, which allowed for a major victory for U.S. imperialism. Something similar happened in Grenada. I'm afraid to say, you mentioned Maurice Bishop, his birthday. Well, of course, his overthrow in 1983 came as a result of a U.S. invasion, but the Governor General's role was not pristine. And I think that understandably in Canada, there's discussion about a republic, moving towards a republican system. But if Canada and progressive forces talk about moving towards republicanism without a sharp critique about how republicanism has unfolded south of the border, where you basically had a migration from the divide and right of monarchs to the divine right of propertied men of European descent, I don't think republicanism is going to gain much traction. And so there are a lot of contradictions right now with regard to Canadian politics. The fact is that Canada has complicated relations with all the major powers, United States, India, China, Russia. It's trying to snuggle up closer to the European Union and France, which I wholly understand. But at the same time, it's going to have to improve relations with those aforementioned powers, at least I would think India, China, and Russia. That does not seem to be in the offing as we speak. But in any case, it seems that we may have reached the closure of this particular program.
Yes, and I misspoke because I was thinking about Prince Philip Mitchell, the singer out of Louisville, Kentucky. He had a song about being from the city of the Big Three: Kentucky Fried Chicken, Ali, and me. So that was I was trying to make a joke out of that, but I misspoke and made a fool of myself. But we will see you next week, sir.
Good luck to you.
All right, and would like to thank Lisa Watson for her technical brilliance, and I would also like to say that tomorrow morning I will be on the Carl Nelson Show to kick off Black Music Month at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we will be talking about Black Music Month, and I will definitely be talking about the Vlads, or the people that are faking the funk, the Pinocchio theory people. You fake the funk.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.